I've always been pretty lucky with work. I've been fired a few times and I've quit, the old not wanting to suffer fools gladly thing. But I've always operated on the principle of having a little bit of a buffer, just a little bit of money in the bank. But how much do you reckon you need to have in the bank in case you lose your job, either by your choice or someone else's? How long do you think you could last on $18,000, for example? Just imagine you're laid off work. You've got to buy rent, food, fuel, maybe you've got car rego in there, appliances might start blowing up, a fridge. A couple of things are always going to go wrong, aren't they? How long do you reckon until you've got $0? 3 months, 4 months, 5 months? Do you think you could last for half a year? Well, the Morrison government wants to extend the liquid assets wait time from 3 months to 6 months, and basically it would mean that you can't access income support. You can't go on the dole, in other words, for 6 months if you've got that amount of money in the bank. Labor MP Linda Burney thinks it's unfair, particularly on middle-aged and older workers, and she joins me in the studio now. Linda, hello.
Good afternoon, Paul. How are you?
Oh, I'm excellent, thank you. Now, we know that our social security network is there as a safety net. What's the balance between preserving valuable resources for the community? It's a major budgetary expense, as we know. A lot of people ageing, a lot of people going on the pension. Isn't the government right to be trying to protect that valuable resource and distributing it in a more even and equitable way?
There's nothing wrong with even distribution. There's nothing wrong with equitable distribution. But this is not fair. If you are in your 50s or 60s, you have been made redundant, and Newcastle is a town and an area that knows what that feels like, and you are expected to wait for 6 months. At the moment it's 3 months, but you're expected to wait 6 months if you've got a redundant payment or some liquid assets, for example, a payment coming to you, some money you might have lent to your kids, some bonds, those sorts of things. For the government to expect you to run down every single thing that you own so that you don't have the buffer that you spoke about before you can access social security, to me, is wrong. We're talking about people that have worked their entire lives, that have paid taxes, and very often been in the same industry for their entire lives. And the other aspect, of course, is that it is, to me, unfair that people should use all their assets before they can access social security. That, to me, does not make sense in the long run.
I get the point you're making about older people, because you may not get another job. If I'm given a redundancy payment at my age, I'm 60, I may never get another job, unfortunately. That's the nature of the employment market at the moment. If I'm 30, though, it's different, isn't it? Shouldn't I be using the money, the income that I've earned while I was working?
The argument that I'm making is that the liquid assets wait time at the moment is 13 weeks, 3 months. And to double it to 6 months is the problem here. I don't have a problem with having to wait a little while, but if you've got to retrain, if you've got to, if one of your kids gets sick, then that's another issue. So there is a wait time at the moment. What the government's arguing is that without any science, without any explanation, they're going to double the wait time. And that's one thing, Paul, it's a cash grab.
So you're the Minister, Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians and for Families and Social Services. Tell me about Indigenous Australians. Are they likely to be adversely affected by this change?
Indigenous Australians will be affected by this change, but the really odious thing that the government has introduced, and it's gone through the House of Representatives, it'll be debated in the Senate early next year, is a thing called the cashless debit card. So there are 4 trial sites for this card at the moment. If you're on a social security payment, bar the age pension, if you're living in these areas, then you have 80% of your dole payment or your a DSP payment quarantined. And the government wants to do that en masse across the Northern Territory without any discussion or consultation. It breaches human rights principles. The people in the Territory are already on a thing called a Basics Card, where 50% of your income is quarantined. And what the people in the Territory are saying is that we don't need any more plastic in our lives.
Yeah. But for those individuals who have a track record of not making wise decisions for themselves, is there a better way to support them than quarantining that?
My argument is that there are cases where quarantining is appropriate, particularly when it's a child protection issue, or if there is issues of being really dysfunctional and being on the child protection register. But let's remember the Northern Territory has probably the strictest regime in the country, the strictest regime in the country for consumption of alcohol. So the big question is, why does the federal government, without talking to 23,000 people, 80% of them Aboriginal, think that they can come in over the top with yet another extension of the Northern Territory intervention, in my view?
Linda Burney, violence, of course, domestic violence is another issue. It's, of course, as we know, the statistics are sad within all communities and more so in the Indigenous communities, as we know. But it's a broad community problem, what we do about domestic violence, and it's a topic of discussion for you this evening. It
is. I'm speaking at the Conservatorium this afternoon with two other very notable women that are clearly a lot smarter than me. They've both written books. And we're talking on the issue of domestic violence. And the point that I'll be making, Paul, is that domestic violence doesn't discriminate. It cuts across all cultures. It cuts across all socio-economic groups. It cuts across the whole of society. And the issue is, and this is controversial, I do not see it through a gendered perspective. I see it through the perspective of everyone taking responsibility. If we're really going to deal with domestic and sexual violence, then there has to be both men and women involved in the resolution, the identification of the issue. And one of the more pointed issues, I'll obviously be speaking from my own perspective. I've had a personal experience with domestic violence, and I know what I'm talking about. So the issue, of course, for First Nations women is, well, for all women really, is not just the statistic that we hear regularly trotted out in Australia, which is a national crisis, and that is that every week, on average, there's a woman murdered in Australia, usually at the hands of someone that she knows or a present or past partner. But the other aspect that often goes unspoken about is the thousands and thousands of women that are hospitalised, that end up with permanent brain injury, permanent disability, broken bones, and of course the other point that I'll be making, the final point, is the intergenerational trauma and the way in which this problem or this terrible scourge in our society is passed through generations.
Linda Burney, that's on tonight at 5:30 at the Conservatorium. Thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you very much.
Labor MP and Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians and for Families and Social Services, Linda Burney, joining us on ABC Newcastle.